This is another challenging chips video where I look at some types of chips that are harder than they seem. They're a simple, basic sort of shape or something we're used to, but for whatever reason they're trickier to get good results than what you might expect. And so for this one, it's straight lines, and it's maybe not too surprising. Carving straight lines is probably about as challenging as drawing a perfectly straight line. The one advantage we have in chip carving is the straight line is already drawn. We already have the target, and we just need to trace that with the knife. But that doesn't change the fact that actually moving your hand and the knife in a perfectly straight line is still a challenging thing to do. So I've got a triangle here of three different straight lines, and they all go in different directions across, with respect to the grain. So I think the hardest one, in my experience anyway, to carve a truly good, consistent straight line is ones that run directly with the grain, directly along the grain lines. And that's because the knife blade likes to get stuck in between the grain, and it'll kind of follow the grain lines rather than the lines, the carving lines that we want. And also, depending on the thickness of the blade that you're using, it can start to split the grain apart, and so you end up kind of tearing and splitting the grain rather than cutting through it. So those are kind of the challenges to along the grain. But for all of the types of straight line cuts, you want to make sure that your forearm is basically parallel to the shape of the line that you're going to be cutting. So that way, as you draw your hand back, you're naturally moving in the straight line that you're trying to cut. And one thing that I will say is it might be better, especially as you're practicing and getting used to this, is to actually start there and then rotate it a little bit in that direction so that now the line is kind of pointing into your hand a little bit. And what that does is now if I come off of the line, I'm coming into the part that I'm trying to cut, rather than if it were too far this way and I get off the line, now I'm coming into this part of the wood which I don't want to cut. So it's better to err on the side of carving into the line rather than outside of it. But one key aspect of carving straight lines is to have enough confidence to just have the knife flowing smoothly like that. You don't want to be going very slowly and trying to make micro adjustments. You want to get the knife lined up, get it right in that line, and then just move, not quickly, but a nice consistent flowing, and whatever pace feels comfortable or makes sense for you might be different. You can see kind of the speed at which I do straight lines and tend to get good results. So yeah, straight along the grain is pretty tricky. You can see I've got a little bit of a wider section right here, and then it's a little bit narrower on the ends. So there's not a whole lot that you can do to make them truly perfect, but obviously practice will improve and kind of get used to where you tend to need fixes or adjustments. The next direction for the grain is directly across the grain, and this one's easier than along the grain lines because it's kind of a more consistent you're just cutting straight across the lines, the grain, and it's not really trying to move the knife. The only issue here is you'll have a little bit more resistance as you're cutting across more grain lines, so the knife isn't going to just slide quite as smoothly. You're going to feel a little bit more of that drag. You can kind of hear the different sound that makes as well, cutting across that way. But that's easier, I find, just because the grain feel is consistent. The knife is able to just kind of do what it wants without being bothered as much by the grain, as long as you're able to keep that smooth direction. And then the third thing to be aware of is when you're going at an angle along either in this direction. If I were to carve my normal way, I'd be coming this way, and that would be against the grain. So that's something you can do. That is depending on the angle. If the grain direction this way, if I were carving a line that's oriented like that, I would not want to carve against the grain. The more you carve close to but slightly against the grain, the worse results you're going to get. But in a situation like this where it's 45 degrees, well away from the grain lines, there's no real issue in making this cut against the grain in my normal direction. But you may get better results, or again, if the line is close to along the grain, you might need to switch to the reverse grip and carve this way. And as with always, if you're switching, you want to make sure that you get the angle of the knife the same. And I like to use my left hand to push and kind of guide. I tend to move a little bit more slowly in this direction, but I can use my left hand to help guide that line. So up to you on if you want to learn the backwards or do it against the grain based on what that is. But those are, I would say, kind of the I guess 3 main tips here. One is make sure that the line is lined up with your hand correctly so that it's giving you the best edge to naturally make a straight line. 2 is to keep the knife flowing smoothly and not get caught up in trying to be too slow. And then the other thing is, as always, a sharp knife. The sharper the knife, the more easily it's going to make its way through, and you're going to be able to have control over the cutting through the wood.